Sometimes the pivot is not quite where we want that. It's useful to place the pivot where we want it for scaling, rotation. Let's say it is a door hinge, for example. So here in this example, I can scale from this bottom location to scale this wall up, or from the side here to scale in that way. Or maybe I want to rotate my actor in this way. So being able to place the pivot where we want that is important. Okay, so we can press and hold Alt and middle mouse button click where we want to place the pivot. This is going to offset the pivot. Now notice that if I lose my selection and I select my actor again, the pivot is going to revert back to its default location. I can also right click where I want to place that pivot and go to the pivot menu and click set pivot here. Now to prevent that pivot offset from reverting back to its default location each time, we can right click, go to pivot and set actor pivot offset. Now if I select another actor and I select this actor again, that pivot offset is going to stay there. When working with pivots, I prefer to isolate the actor or the actors that I'm working with. For example, I will select the actor that I want to set the pivot on. So in this case, this wall piece here. And because I want to isolate this in the level, I also want to select a light, such as the directional light. Then I will right click and go to my visibility section and select show only selected. And that is going to isolate the directional light and this wall piece here. So now I can work with this pivot. We can middle mouse button click and drag on the pivot as well to move that around. Now we can snap the pivot to a vertex. Now before I continue, I usually turn off grid snapping just to make it easier to work with. And as I mentioned, I also prefer here to isolate the actors that I'm working with. Alright, so I'll press Alt and V and then I will middle click and drag on that pivot. And now I can snap that. Maybe I want to set the pivot offset to one of these bottom vertices so that I can rotate from that position. Now we don't want to lose that when we deselect the actor again. So right click, go to the pivot menu and select set as pivot offset. Now you have to be careful with this because if you drag with the middle mouse button and then you do Alt V, that could create a copy of the actor. I'm not sure if that is a bug in the current version of the engine, but just look out for that. So again, press and hold Alt V and then move your pivot where you want that to snap with the middle mouse button. And Ctrl H to unhide all of the actors. Now it's important to note that this is an offset, so it's not going to affect the pivot of the static mesh. So for example, the pivot is right over here where we set that, but if I navigate to that asset in the content browser and I drag in another instance of that, notice that the pivot is still where it was originally. We can reset that offset, so I'll just right click here to bring up the context menu, go into the pivot menu, and then we have this option reset pivot offset. And as you can see, that pivot now snaps back to its original position. Now there is actually a way of modifying that pivot on the static mesh, and we'll look at that next. Traditionally, if you wanted to modify the pivot point of the static mesh, you would have to go into a DCC application such as Blender, for example, and then modify that. Set the pivot where you want that and then re-import that asset. But we no longer have to do that in Unreal Engine because we have the modeling tools. So with this asset, for example, the pivot is at the center of that. And maybe I want that to be at the bottom. And I don't want to add an offset. I actually want to modify that pivot so that each time I drag and drop that asset into my level, the pivot will still be at the bottom of that static mesh. To do this, I will switch to the modeling mode. And in the XForm section, I'll actually just spin this modeling tab here. I will click edit pivot and then we can edit the pivot. So we have these handles so we can move it around. And we also have this box position section, which will place the pivot following a bounding box. So I'll select bottom and that's going to place that at the bottom of my asset and I will click accept. It's important to note that this will edit the asset. So you might want to create a duplicate of the asset before you actually commit these changes. So with that done, I will switch back to select mode here, go into the content browser, drag and drop an instance of that into my level. As we can see, that pivot is now at the bottom of my asset. It's often the case that the pivot is not exactly where you want it, that is with asset packs and so on. So this is a way of setting the pivot point without having to round trip to other applications.